Good afternoon. Hope you are doing well. Welcome to our today's session on political violence. Today we'll talk about the idea of political violence. Then we'll talk about the explanations, the whole, reasons of political violence, in, institutional explanations, ideational explanations, and individual explanations. We'll also talk about the cultural explanations of violence with a special reference to Samuel Huntington. We'll also talk about the problems with culturalist explanations with reference to Fosna article. Both of these articles are floated in Google Drive. Please check. And finally, we will talk about the forms of political violence, specifically revolution and terrorism. So what is political violence? You may are aware of revolutions such as French Revolution, Communist Revolution, Maoist Revolution, Communist Revolution in Soviet Union, Maoist Revolution in China, or such as Bangladeshi Independent War of 1971, Civil War or subnationalist war such as insurgency in Chittagong Hill Tracks from 1975 to 1997. You may aware the riots, hey, such as communal riots within South Asian societies. You may aware of uh, Great Calcutta Riot, Noakhali Riot in 1946, Kishorganj Riot, strikes such as Hortal within our South Asian context. So political violence is the use of force in the forms of revolutions, wars, civil war, riots, or strikes to achieve some political objective. So why political violence? Political scientists have offered diverse reasons on what actually lead to civilians to take up arms against the state or its own fellow citizen, or sometimes a state itself take up arms against its own citizenry towards some political aim. Patrick O'Neill broadly categorizes three explanations of political violence: institutional, ideational, and individual. Though these explanations overlap to some degree, but there are a few common questions, such as what motivates political violence and toward what end is it perpetrated. So, in terms of institutional explanation, uh, existing institutions such as it could be political institutions, it could be culture cultural institutions, it could be religious institutions, it could be economic institutions. So existing institutions may encourage violence or constrain human action, creating a violent backlash. So think about political institutions such as state or regime. Think about within authoritarian regime, what actually happened. Any kind of authoritarian regime, naturally they are to some extent they are suppressive. They always try to suppress the opponent voice. So in majority, you will see in think about any authoritarian state. Think about the Tunisia. Think about the China. Think about other countries or authoritarian regime exists. So in authoritarian regime, whenever any kind of political protest intensified, the authoritarian regime always try to suppress those protests or alternative voices through using military forces. Think about Tiananmen Square's movement in China in 1989, how China government suppressed the voices of the lower people. Think about what actually happened in Iran. Think about what actually happened in Tunisia during Jane Ali. Think about Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge period. The communist regime they tried to suppress the voice of the opponents. So institutional reason is called political institutions. It could be economic institutions sometimes, within the global order. Think about in many part of the world, তোমার হচ্ছে poverty, famine, it often lead to violence. Think about the South Sudan, many of the cases. Ideational ideas may justify or promote use of violence. So we already talked about the nationalism. You have already read the Erickson's article, how nationalistic ideas, fallow feelings towards towards other people, how often it lead to violence in immediate part of the world. So even think about the Bangladeshi independent war of 1971. Yeah, people, yeah, they were in a common ground, they were in a common landscape, yeah, under the umbrella of Bengali nationalism. Uh, Religious fundamentalism also justify or promote the use of violence. You are aware of the ISIS, you are aware of Indian Bajrang Party or RSS, you are aware of Taliban rule in Afghanistan. We have already talked about it. Individual explanation, psychological or strategic factors may lead people to carry out violence. Recently, I read 2 to 3 articles on radical groups, on those who have operated their military operations in Bangladesh. What actually revealed that the majority of the uh, ridiculous people, they argued that they operated this kind of violence from a sense of alienation, from a sense of humiliation, from a sense of eh, deprivation. They assume that their own ideology, their own belief, it is being suppressed, they are being alienated, and so on. We'll also talk about it. Okay. Okay. Now, the culturalist explanations of political violence. You should read, I think you have already read Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington argues that in the first Cold War world, most conflicts will take place due to cultural reasons. His text addresses the structure of global politics in the post Cold War world. After the Cold War came to an end and the world was no longer dominated by the two superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union, how are international affairs reorganized? How can we characterize the balance of power in the world today? And where does Western civilization fit into mix? Let me open another slide. You may read the article of Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington, in his article, "The Clash of Civilizations," the, he he developed the reasons of political violence. Main points of his articles are uh, the pattern of conflict, how it will shape from Cold War pattern to new pattern, the nature of civilizations, why civilizations will clash, the front line between civilizations, the West versus the race, the Chinese and Islamic connections, and the implications for the West. So, first of all, he showed the evolution of human conflict. Before French Revolution, princes and monarchs, they always tried to expand their territories and which often lead to clashes among them. Wars between nations from the French Revolution until the First World War. However, following the Second World War, conflict started between two ideologies, specifically Western uh, uh, so-called democratic ideology versus Soviet Union so-called communist ideology. However, new world era after the end of the Cold War started. Okay, so what actually the new world era? In the politics of civilizations, the people and government of non-Western civilizations no longer remain the objects of history as targets of Western colonialism, but step up to the plate to join the West as movers and shapers of history. So the nature of the civilizations. What is civilization? The highest cultural groupings of people and the broadcast level of cultural identity people have is a civilization. Thus, a civilization is a cultural entity. So, what is culture? You have already read it. What is culture? Okay. So, culture is what actually is we are. I think we already talked about. You already read it from SOC 101 course. So civilization can be, it can be, or can be form with all elements of culture, or only one. It can be huge or it can be really small. So civilization rise and fall as history tells us. They disappear and get varied in the sense of time. So currently Huntington argued that there are eight main civilizations. These are Western civilizations, Chinese civilization or Confucian civilization, Japanese civilization, Islamic civilization, Hindu civilization, Slavic Orthodox civilization, Latin American civilization, and African civilization. So why civilizations will clash? Huntington argued that these civilizations have differences and these differences can easily produce conflicts. হ্যাঁ, এই যে the flourishing of globalization, weakening the nation state as a term of self-identification and the replace of these eight by religion, de-westernization in other parts of the world. So, so even the increase of economic regionalism, understanding of the idea that you are in which part. So all these reasons actually will lead to clash. Okay? So there are two main battlefronts. To Huntington, the micro level battlefront is adjacent groups along the fault lines between civilizations struggle, often violently, over the control of territory with each other. On the other hand, macro level states from different civilizations compete for relative military and economic power and competitively promote their political and religious values. So the fault lines between civilizations. The political and economic boundaries of the Cold War got replaced from the fault lines between civilizations. So think about what actually happened before 90s during the age of the Cold War. The world mostly divided by two parts. Either you were in the side of Western Democratic Front or you are in the side of so-called Communist Front. And the whole world boundaries mostly divided in two lines. However, following the collapse of Soviet Union, the political and economic boundaries of the Cold War got replaced from the fault lines between civilizations. The West became more dependent on the Persian Gulf countries for its energy. In the Arab world, the attempts of the Westerners to influence them have caused anti-Western political forces. The underlying differences between China and the United States have reasserted themselves in areas such as human rights, trade, and weapons proliferation. The cultural difference between Japan and USA and racism between also causes economic and cultural conflict. Civilization railing, the king country syndrome. The king country, so what is king country? The king country syndrome is replacing political ideology and traditional balance of power considerations as the principal basis for cooperation and coalitions. So think about while only a few Muslim governments overtly supported Saddam Hussein during 1990s Kuwait aggression, many Arab elites privately cheered him on, and he was highly popular among large sections of the Arab publics. Islamic fundamentalist movements universally supported Iraq rather than the Western-backed governments of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So think about the recent conflict in uh, Central Asia, specifically between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The majority of the Muslim elite, Muslim people from all over the world, they have one kind of covert support towards uh, Azerbaijan. On the other hand, the Western people, they have one kind of covert uh, alienation or covert support towards Armenia. Think about the Bosnia War during 1995. Majority of the European Christians, European peoples, they supported the Serbs aggression. On the other hand, the majority of the Muslim people, they were in favor of Bosnia. Pursuing Arab nationalism, Saddam Hussein explicitly invoked an Islamic appeal at that moment during Iraq War in 90s. So Saddam and his supporters attempted to define the war as a war between the civilizations. Even think about following the 9/11, what actually George Bush declared that this is a war, this is one kind of crusade. So they attempted to define the war as a war between the civilizations. What makes the West so powerful? the differences between the West versus the rest. Western military power unrivaled. Military conflict between Western states is unthinkable. Enormous economic growth within European societies and Western societies. Huge capital accumulation in Western societies since colonial period. Even Council and the IMF reflect the interest of the West, presenting them as the interest of the world economy. Differences between the West and the rest: military, economic, and institutional power disputes. On a cultural level, the basic ideas of Western civilization on topics like democracy, law, liberty, human rights don't seem to have any value on the rest of the world. Okay. So think about the values within Asian societies: group value, Western societies individualistic value, within Asian context trust, Western stick to rules, Asian societies compromise, Western confront, flexible reasoning. Three types of reaction to the West by non-Western civilizations. Three types of reaction. It could be through isolation, balance, or bandwagoning. So bandwagoning. So the leaders of these countries, specifically in torn countries, typically wish to pursue a bandwagoning strategy and make their countries members of the West, but the history, culture, and traditions of their countries are non-Western. So torn countries such as Turkey, Mexico, and Russia. Three pillars for a country to redefine its civilizational identity: its political and economic elite has to be generally supportive of and enthusiastic about this move. So whether it's elite, economic or political elite, whether they're enthusiastic towards this bandwagoning or not, its public has to be willing to make the redefinition. The dominant groups in the recipient civilization have to be willing to embrace the convert. All three parts exist in Mexico. So think about the elite, a political and economic elite. They're mostly generally supportive of this move of Mexican societies. Its Mexican public has to be willing to make the redefinition. On the other hand, the Western, they are also the dominant group in the Western societies are also willing to embrace the convert. On the other hand, this is true in Mexican societies. On the other hand, in terms of the Turkey, the Western people, though there are first two types of tomar hoche feelers exist, but the Westerns are most reluctant to embrace the convert, and still it is unsure of any exist in Russia. The Chinese Islamic connection. De-Westernized countries forge connections between them to help them defend themselves against the Western world. Rise of military power from the Confucian Islamic countries and the reduction of it in Western countries. We now see China, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea trying to modernize their military equipment and exchanging military parts between them. A Chinese Islamic military connection has thus come into being, designed to promote acquisition by its members of the weapons and weapons technologies needed to counter the military power of the West. So think about how Turkey helped the Azerbaijan during recent war. Think about the ties between China and Pakistan. Implications for the West. So within this landscape of cultural war, Samuel Huntington argues that the Western must accept its own civilization as unique instead of wanting to make it universal. Above all, West must protect this unique culture from non-Western influence. If the United States continues to embrace multiculturalism, for example, it will eventually lose its central identity as a Western nation. It will no longer be identifiable as the United States, but rather will become something closer to the United Nations. The preservation of Western culture is also important when it comes to making sure that the world as a whole can maintain the multi-civilizational nature of world politics. The West must stop trying to universalize and must instead allow other civilizations to hold on to their unique culture and values. Only by rejecting multiculturalism and embracing multi-civilizationalism can the world avoid devolving into conflicts between the major civilizations? However, the way Samuel Huntington highlighted the nature of political conflict based on cultural explanation, it is mostly challenged by Dan Fosna. He worked on two ethnic groups in Zambia and Malawi, to African countries. So he worked on two ethnic groups, Shivas and Tumbukas. So both of these ethnic groups, they are living both in Zambia and also in Malawi. In Zambia, both of these ethnic groups actually they are allies. However, in Malawi, both are antagonistic. So so think about if we go through the from cultural explanation, we can notice that there are allies in one countries and there are adversaries in other countries. So there are problems in cultural explanations. There are other reasons. There could be other reasons which may lead to political violence. So this is not necessarily because of the cultural reason always political violence happen or exists. So working on Chivas and Tumbukas, both in Zambia and Malawi, Fosnar argued that the divisions between the Chivas and Tumbukas in Malawi are politically salient because they are large groups whose mobilization is highly beneficial for the competition of state resources. On the other hand, in neighboring Zambia, where both groups are small, they tend to be mobilized together as part of a larger coalition, which ultimately reduce the salience of the cleavage that exists between them. At the center of this study are political actors who use ethnic demography as a way to mobilize and advance their agenda. Now we will talk about the forms of political violence. Patrick O'Neill focuses on two major forms of political violence. One is revolution and another is terrorism. Other revolution, what is revolution? Revolution is an uprising of the masses who take to the streets, seize control of the state, and depose the old regime. In contrast, terrorism is much more secret and hidden, a conspirational action carried out by a small group, but there are similarities in their sources and goals. Other forms of political violence include assassinations, riots, rebellions, military coups, civil war, ethnic conflict. Okay, so revolution. Okay, revolution can be defined as public seizure of the state in order to overturn the existing government and regime. Revolutions involve some element of public participation. To be certain, revolutions typically have leaders, organizers, and instigators who play a key role. But unlike a coup in which elites overthrow the government, in a revolution of the in a revolution, the public plays an important role in seizing power. Russia is an interesting example, where we typically speak of communism's triumph in 1917 as a revolution. Some scholars call it a coup because Lenin and a handful of his followers seized power rather than being part of some mass action tackling the government. Therefore, the objectives of revolution is not simply removing those in power, but regime change and seizure of state control, though money, through mass participation. So, revolution always be violent or non-violent. It could be violent or it could be non-violent. During revolution, violence is often difficult to avoid. Governments often resist overthrow, and such conflict can often lead to the fragmentation of the monopoly of violence as parts of the state, such as elements of the military, often outside the revolutionaries. The aftermath of revolution can also be very bloody. The losers may kill, or the winners may also kill its opponents or carry out a counter-revolutionary struggle against the new regime. So think about what actually happened following 1947 and 1971 in Bangladesh. So 1971, the Bengalis they are mostly eh, they're the victim. Think about the Bengalis are the mostly victim. Yes, suffered. Think about what actually happened. Is suffered not only by the Pakistani military forces, but ethnic groups such as Biharis. And think about what actually happened following the war. Yeah. uh, Biharis started to be uh, killed, targeted, and so on. However, not all revolutions are violent. In 1989, communist regimes in Western Europe collapsed in the face of public pressure, sweeping away institutions that many thought immovable. So, due to the absence of violence, many scholars would resist calling the collapse of communism in Western Europe revolutionary, preferring instead to speak of these changes as political transitions. Now, what causes revolution? Okay, so during following Second World War, majority of the academic journals and articles, the most studies of revolutionary events, it was unsystematic and mostly descriptive. But following Second World War, studies of uh, disruptive change such as modernization as driving revolutionary action, relative deprivation model developed, gap between expectations and actual conditions developed. And after 1980s, majority of the studies focused on domestic and international state power as providing the opening for revolution. Now, the terrorism. Terrorism carries a stigma and is a term few willingly embrace. As a result, some confuse terrorism with a variety of other words, many of which are misleading, while others use the term indiscriminately to describe any kind of political force or policy they oppose. This situation has led some to conclude that terrorism is effectively impossible to define, and they fall back on an old cliche. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Yeah. Such a conclusion undercuts the whole purpose of the political science, which is to define our terms objectively. However, terrorism can be defined as the use of violence by non-state actors against civilians to achieve a political goal. Terrorism could also be state-sponsored. States do sometimes sponsor non-state terrorist groups as a means to extend their power by proxy, using terrorism as an instrument of foreign policy. For example, India has long faced terrorist groups fighting for control over Kashmir, a state with a majority Muslim population. So these terrorists are widely believed to be trained and armed by the Pakistani military. So 2 days back, you may have aware of a BBC report that the Bangladeshi border guard they complain that Bangladesh facing terrorist groups fighting in Chittagong hill tracks, and majority of these groups they are trained in Mizoram by Indian forces and so on. However, there are debates whether they are terrorists or freedom fighters. That is different. Okay, so forms of state and political violence. So see this chart. So if the target is a state and the actor is state, then it is war. So think about war between two states. Think about the war between Iraq and USA, war between USA and Afghanistan, Soviet Union versus Afghanistan. So if the targets are the state, but actor is non-state, then that is guerrilla war. So actor non-state. So think about the guerrilla war in 1972. So think about the guerrillas, how they work. So think about within Indian state mechanism, the Naxal movement, they are fighting against the Indian armies. So they are fighting against the Indian state. So these are the guerrilla war. When the target is the civilian and the actor is state, that is, we often label it as human rights violations, war crimes, such as think about the in many states. Think about what actually going on in Arakan, the Myanmar state. They are targeting its own citizenry, such as Rohingyas and so on. And when the actor is non-state and also targeted civilian, that is often labeled as terrorism. However, this kind of terrorism, it could be a state-sponsored terrorism also. Okay. Now, the reasons of terrorism. Again, three approaches. Institutional approaches. Uh, Reasons. What are the reasons of the terrorism? Economic approach argued that economic conditions such as poverty and lack of education are a common reason for terrorism. And these causes are commonly cited in this regard, and terrorism is viewed as a tool of desperation when avenues for personal advancement, getting a job, starting a family are absent or blocked. Different regime types are also associated with different levels of risk of terrorism, lower of authoritarian regimes, moderate for democratic regimes, and higher for illiberal and transitional regimes. However, there are criticisms of institutional explanation. Terrorists are not necessarily impoverished. Think about Osama bin Laden and other European terrorists. They are active in, who are active in 1970s or came from a wealthy background. Additional explanations. Terrorism is attributed to some ideology, religion, nihilism, or set of values. So think about what actually going on. তোমার হচ্ছে in the name of religion, religious war, in the name of nationalist war, national backlash. And the final was the individual explanations. We have already talked about it, the feeling of injustice, alienation, and humiliation when individual feel a sense of injustice, alienation, or humiliation often lead them to involve in terrorism or terrorist-like activities. However, this explanation failed to explain why individuals respond differently to injustice, alienation, and humiliation. Think about many people, they are feeling a sense of injustice to a certain kind of incidents, and others they are not feeling that kind of sense. Okay, so thank you all.